Hello, good morning, everyone. Yes, it's quite fitting that yesterday we finished with Scott Giffert giving this panel discussion about imaging standards, because that's what I'm going to be talking about this morning. So please do hold back your enthusiasm and cheers. Fantastic, a laugh. Okay, so I'm Andrew Bruce. I'm a photographer at the Postal Museum in London, which only opened about 2 years ago. And I love imaging standards, okay? I think they're great. So, as we know, cameras are typically designed to create attractive results and not accurate results. So we have kind of, quite attractive, contrasty, saturated on the left, and much more accurate on the right. And what cameras create is typically not uniform. So here I've got 5 cameras giving me JPEGs straight from the camera, and they're all slightly different, okay, so not uniform. But of course, it doesn't have to be this way. We can create objective, high-quality images. Again, we've got exactly the same photograph here, but this time processed in 4 different applications. Okay, so the same raw file processed with 4 different derivatives, all slightly different. Again, not good for us. So this just underlines the importance of standards. How do we get objective truth? How do we get data? Standards are important because they provide us with a ruler for which we can hold our images up against. Okay, we can objectively say what's acceptable and what isn't. So I'm the founder and chair of the AFAP Imaging Standards Working Group. We're a subgroup of AFAP. We're a working group currently formed of 9 museums from a diverse range of different cultural heritage institutions. We're not affiliated with any of the one standards. We're not affiliated to any manufacturers. We're focused, and this is the important part, on raising education and understanding of the practical implementation of imaging standards. Okay? And I'm conscious of the fact that it's quite likely the person who came up with this is in the room. This is a screenshot from ISO 19264-1. I really hope I'm not breaking any laws by giving you a little sample of it for free. This is wonderful. This is so important, okay? But the conversations that I'm keen on having are taking the color science, the maths, and the algorithm and putting them into terms that photographers can understand and put into application practically. Okay. I want us all to have more discussion about the practical implementation of imaging standards. So here I go. I'll lead by example. Okay. This beautiful piece here, this is a Konica Minolta Dynax 7D. It was in fact Konica Minolta's first ever digital SLR, and it was released 15 years ago. So it's a bit of a museum item itself. It has a 6.1 million pixel CCD sensor. And I asked myself, would it be possible to make this quite early digital camera meet, arguably quite stringent digitization imaging standards? So if it could meet ISO 19264-1, made only using free software. So let's see. Okay, and also we need a few targets. I love targets as well. So I started work in my studio with 2 Elinchrom xenon flashlights placed at 40 degrees, fitted with strip softbox and grids. I started by photographing one of my Don Williams fantastic object-level targets. As it's only a 6.1 million pixel camera, I decided I'd make life easy and be kind and only photograph quite a small area of just 16 by 25 centimeters. This gave me a sampling frequency of 304 pixels per inch. The software that is free to download, that I'm using to process my raw files is Raw Therapy. Has anyone used that before? Any hands up? Oh yeah, quite a few, good. So it's a graphical user interface of DC Raw, which is an open source raw processing software. So I'm processing my MRW raw files, and basically what I do at this point is I switch everything off. Everything is set to manual, not auto. No sharpening, no contrast, no input color profile, no noise reduction, and all I do is I set the white balance, just clicking on one of the neutral grey patches. I then set my camera to aperture priority and use the ambient light to make a series of exposures at varying apertures. I visually assess which the sharpest aperture is, but to be honest, there's no difference between f4 and f11. I guess basically this is because the sensor is so low resolution that the lens out-resolves it massively. So the effects of diffraction are basically invisible to the sensor. I choose to go with f8, always safe. I then flat field calibrate by photographing a sheet of grey foam board to precisely remove the light fall off that my lens creates. So you can see here kind of the before and after calibration. If I use Photoshop and the histogram panel, which has the lovely standard deviation tool, then I can verify that I have a standard deviation of just 1.02 L star over the entire frame. Pretty good. I'm now looking for the exposure where the brightest patch on my target is the closest to what it should be. Okay, so I'm just moving the flash light output up and down in 1/10 of a stop increments. What I love about the Don Williams target is that the value, the spectrophotometer measured values of the patches are printed directly under the patches. So we have the C-Lab numbers here. So I'm looking at the brightest patch there, patch 10. So this should be 97.06 L star in brightness. I can hover my mouse over this and find the image and the power output of my flash, which gets me the closest to that. So you can see I've circled very neatly in red that I get to 96.9 L star. Fantastic. So that's the flash power that I'm going to use. What I need to do now, though, is I need to make my camera see how humans see. So here I've got basically, I'm showing you what the default contrast settings are on the software, and then what happens after I then kind of calibrate my camera, okay, to create basically an accurate tone response, also known as the optoelectronic conversion function, which is a great title. So basically what I'm doing is I'm calibrating my camera to see the same way as the human eye sees. So we can see here a nice diagram that I think I stole from Cambridge in colour, how a digital camera sees light and how the human eye sees light. So how do I do this calibration procedure? Using a tool that I'm sure we all use, curves. So raw therapy is especially good at this because it allows me to have a C-Lab curve. So a curve where I'm only adjusting the L star, only adjusting the lightness and not so much the color, which is just what I want. I'm just interested in the tone, the lightness values. So basically I use a UTT, which has got these neutral gray patches spaced in 5 L star. And I put a point on every one of those patches, and you can see on the curves here. And then I just nudge them up and down until I get the right L star values. So starting from the left, 95 L star, 90 L star, 85 L star, etc. Just to give you like kind of a practical example of this, this is 2 images from a book scanner, 2 Canon 750D photographs taken on an ATIS book scanner. And from standard, actually, they see lightness quite differently. You know, one of them is a little bit brighter than the other, just out of the box. So, of course, this is something that we can fix. And, of course, with a book scanner, where you're going to have two images of 2 pages next to each other, really important. So I've calibrated the tone response of my camera, and now I need to build an ICC profile. So here I am, being very good and measuring my digital color checker SG with a spectrophotometer. And here is the resulting spreadsheet or text file with CLAB values for each of my patches. I'm using a free piece of software called Coca, which builds ICC profiles using the open source color engine Argyle CMS. So all it does is it compares the CLAB values of my captured image to the CLAB values that my spectrophotometer has measured, and it creates a profile that should hopefully match this as much as possible. So here we can see no profile and then the profile applied, so that effect of the ICC profile working on the colors. This is called characterization. So at this point, I'm now ready to test my image, and I'm going to use OpenDice software from the Library of Congress. This is a tool for measuring to FADGI standards, but I can use it as a measurement tool and simply compare the metrics to what I'm trying to meet in the ISO 19264 standards. So I feed an image of my digital color checker SG into the software, which admittedly is bad practice because I'm validating using the same target I used to build my profile. But I've got no option because it's the only target I can use which I can upload. So it'll work. It tells me that I have a good tone response, which is this diagram here. And this is because I went through and I added the points to my curve to make the camera see lightness the way that a human does. It also tells me that I have pretty good color due to the ICC profile that I had built with an average delta E 2000 of 2.1. But what isn't good is my white balance, as some of the patches on my target that should be neutral have a slight color cast. You know, I'm sure we've all been there where you've clicked on the neutral patch and that goes neutral, but some of the other neutral patches aren't quite there. This is just what's happening here. So we can see on the far left, that's my brightest patch, my brightest neutral patch. That has a slight color cast. And we can see, again in the shadows, especially the second to darkest patch, again, a bit of a color cast. What's also an issue is noise, which, to be honest, isn't surprising considering the age of the camera. I think, you know, I'm really pushing the camera to the limits here, and actually the gamut of the camera is making a difference to the noise values here. So as you can see, my last 2 patches are unacceptably noisy. So how do I correct the white balance issue? Well, again, I'm going to go into raw therapy and I'm going to use curves. This time, instead of using an L-star curve, just working on the lightness, I'm going to use an RGB curve. And you can see here, again, putting these points on the neutral values and just nudging them up and down, you can see how I can alter the color of a very selective tonal area just by, in this case, nudging this point down on the curve. And you can see on the image how that makes it very yellow, okay? So I go through each of these patches and I make them perfectly neutral. So my white balance is really good now. And I can now use raw therapy or take an image into Photoshop and then assess, hovering my mouse over each of the patches, whether I'm getting really neutral and also the correct L-star values that I should. So again, starting from the left, 95, 90, 85. Really, really important. I'm also going to apply some denoise. So I check that this is just about strong enough to bring down the levels in the shadows, and I check this using Photoshop. Again, like I did before to check my illumination uniformity, just using standard deviation. So I'm now getting a standard deviation in this shadow patch of 1.12. So I run my image through OpenDice again, and the adjustments that I've made have worked. Okay, and this is really important. You know, I'm getting feedback from the validation software from OpenDice, and I'm working with it. I'm learning from it. Here's a close-up of the step wedge in my Don Williams object level target. So I'm capturing at 304 pixels per inch. However, I'm not capturing 304 pixels per inch of detail. At the point above the number 300 there, then the lines are spaced at 1/300th of an inch. So if I was capturing 304 pixels per inch of data, I'd be able to see all those 5 lines clearly, but I can't. I can't actually make them out clearly until about quarter of the way back towards 200. So if there were numbers all the way across there, I reckon the point at around where it would say 225 is where I can see all of those 5 lines. So I do the maths, thankfully quite simple. 225 divided by 300 gives me 0.75, or in other words, 75% sampling efficiency. But let's do this a little bit more scientifically, and of course, importantly, objectively. So I use, again, another piece of software from the Library of Congress, the free Auto SFR software. And I feed in some crops of an image from UTT, and this now tells me that I have a sampling efficiency of 80%. Okay? So even though I'm capturing at a sampling rate of 304 ppi, I'm only really getting a resolution of about 245 ppi. So I go back to raw therapy and add a little sharpening. And while this was a real whistle-stop tour, here we are. I've got some images here, photographs that just about meet the ISO 19264-1 standards. Thankfully, my museum collection has quite a lot of small and colourful objects. So here we are. Would I recommend you going out and buying a Konica Dynax 7D? Definitely not. So why have I shown you this? You know, I'm painfully aware that many of you in this room will have known just as much, if not much more, than I've just talked about, okay? I've told you this because if it's possible to make a 15-year-old camera meet these standards, then we can all make our cameras meet these standards. Because these steps that I've just gone through, they are steps that are repeatable with almost any software and any piece of kit. I think it's really important for us to feel really in control of our images and our processing, to understand how to control things and why they're important. And it's this that I think we need to talk more about, okay? In a way, so we need to talk about this in a way that's accessible and it makes sense to photographers, the people who are going to be doing this work, basically. So, you know, these steps that I've just gone through, I go through basically the same steps working with our Phase 1 cameras and Capture One, the same steps working with our book scanners and Lightroom, the same steps with our flatbed scanners and Photoshop. And of course, once I've gone through those steps, the first thing I do is lock everything down. Everything in the software that I can then save as a preset or a default, I do, because I don't want to do this again. And also, you know, repeating this process is just going to build inaccuracy, okay? So, you know, what I've done here is I've calibrated a camera system, and I can use that for documents, for objects, for photogrammetry. Well, hey, here it is. As was mentioned briefly yesterday, anyone who's used more advanced validation software such as DICE, Golden Thread, IQ Analyzer, Zeuchel's QM tool, they'll know from experience that this website is not a quality source to assess and validate your images, okay? But also, you know, actually I'd argue that this website is probably the most influential website for museum imaging, to be honest. I regularly go on and see that users count in the bottom right up in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. It really is popular. And of course it is. It makes validating your imagery simple, quick, easy, and friendly. And it should be. It should be something really quick and easy for us to do, something that's attractive for us all to do. So that has been my talk. My question to you all is, my message to you all is let's talk more about this practically and how we implement these things. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I think a lot of the audience thinks this was a very practical presentation. Felix, please join.
So good morning. I'm really sorry for Ajax for yesterday, I have to tell, because I love football, so first point. I also have to excuse my bad English, but I try my best. I'm from the Bavarian State Library in Munich and work there as a 3D officer, mainly for the Bavaricon cultural portal to bring in 3D stuff. I will want to show you a case study about an old manuscript, CLM 177. It's a very old one from northwest Germany, covered with ivory, wood, and silver platings. And is about 20 to 18 centimeters. For scanning, mainly I use a stripe light scanner from Polymetric. You can see here we have a projector in the middle, and left and right we have two 3D-dimensional cameras and also a texture camera to cover the color. We work with the Qt Sculpture software we already heard about yesterday. And after quite some years now, we could bring in some color management to our workflow. And I want to tell you something about this process, because it's a process we are not finished and we try our best, but there are many things to improve, I think, practically. Before we start, we bring in the spider cube to have information about the quality of our image, the light sources, and we could find white balance and black. So we could have more information later on, but this is only for information. For the scanning, we use a color target, the color checker passport, because it's the only one who fits in the work volume. The other ones normally are too big for small objects. For the process, first we bring in the reference chart. The software make an automatic selection of the chart, of the fields. The fields are segmented. We make a color calibration for the chart, and then we can do the color correction of the image or for the camera. Normally, for this, we assume that we have a linear camera, but first you have to check it, because every industrial camera I think it's different, so you can have differences. The signal, first we find the black level, and then we do a white balance. after this, we bring the colors in the XYZ color gamut with the unknown white point, and then we use a D65 because later on we transfer to sRGB at the moment. Maybe later we use another gamut, but at the moment we find this way. This works quite well, but maybe we can do better or use also Adobe RGB or something else. For the presentation of the final image, you need the gamma correction. Now we have two opportunities to use the texture image. What I said before, we use the texture camera of the scanner, but here we only have 2 megapixels. It's a very noisy signal, especially if you have a few light, it's very bad result, but we can calibrate it quite well. The other opportunity is to use external photos from high resolution cameras, for example, the Mark camera or the Hasselblad. There we have much more pixels for sure. We have a high dynamic range sensor, but the images in the moment first are not calibrated. So I want to show you how we do the internal images. As I said before, we make an image of the chart. Normally you can automatically segment the chart and do the color calibration with white balance and black level settings and get a result. The result is assessed with the metamorphosis standard and shows you if you have a good quality. Sometimes maybe we have not perfect quality, but in the end also bad color calibration is better than no calibration, I think. Because normally in 3D you have no calibration. The other way is to bring in the external photos. You use the raw photos. We convert them in a DNG file, bring them inside, make again the calibration, again assess the result with the metamorphosis standards, and then all the cameras, all the photos for this camera sets are imported in the software. After this step, you use Qt Sculpture for texture mapping. For you as photographers, it's clear, but maybe I tell you also because for the 3D artist, it's not so clear. For the images, for the external photos, you normally use fixed aperture, manual focus, also fixed zoom, and disable the automatic white balance. Also quite sure, but if you're outside in the field, you should look about that the light conditions are not changing a lot. For a very shiny object, it's good to have diffuse light and not direct illumination. And if the light is changing a lot because maybe sun comes through the window or something like this, what happens very often in practical work, you should do a new color calibration. If you use the texture photos inside, also in the 3D software, also what we heard before, there are no standards. Every 3D rendering software works different. Every software handles different the texture images, so also there a lot of work should be done, and you should know what you are doing because of the gamma correction, for example. Some softwares do correction at the beginning automatically, others don't do, or also some do different things at different levels. Normally, I work with Autodesk and 3D Max. There you have the opportunity to bring in the gamma correction and work quite better after the calibration to get really good results. For this, you will have really good results after the texture baking for the 3D model. Also now we get calibrated monitors to have a good response of what we're doing and to really work on good colors. So here is the result of the correction. After the correction, also we have the 3D form of the model. We do single scans which we bring together to a point cloud. The point cloud afterwards is triangulated to a high resolution model and textured. But this high resolution 3D model we cannot show on the internet because the download would take too long. Therefore, we need a reduced model with a lower poly count and a lower data file. For this, we reduce count to about 60 and 70,000 polys. In this point, we don't use triangles, we use quads with a special software. To bring in the missing details, we use normal maps. So the high-res model is the starting point to create a normal map. You see the function of the normal map here. Together with the color and the normal map brought on the low poly model, we create a transportable 3D model which you can download very quickly on the internet. Here you see the low poly on the left without the normal map here on the right, and really looks quite amazing. This is a low poly model also with the color texture. After this, 3D models are integrated in the 3D section of Barbaricon, and you can have a look on it and looking around. Also with the 3D models, the metadata is implemented, so you also have a lot of information about the model. That's it.
Thank you, Felix. You just witnessed one of the biggest Rijksmuseum art handling challenges. That is that mice love the canals in Amsterdam. And there's a lot of water under this museum as well. So it was sort of life treat. We are for our last presentation, Paul.
So, first I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here with you. I feel like a little bit of a fish out of water. As I said yesterday, I'm an art conservator. I'm not a photographer by any means, nor am I a color scientist, even though I do use delta E. Thank you, Roy. So let's just get right into it. Let's talk about this target that I invented with a lot of help with people working in my studio. It's a target for the consistent, interoperable documentation of near ultraviolet visible fluorescence, and we'll get into what that means. This is a device that was born of necessity. About 20 years ago, a long time ago, I was involved as part of my practice as a photograph conservator in this fraud case. In fact, I wrote the report that garnered all of this attention, basically exposing what still is the largest fraud in the fine art photography market. One of the problems with the prints was they had this amazing UV fluorescence. And these are some really bad scans of 35 millimeter slides that I made at the time, trying to document this fluorescence. This fluorescence came from a dye. This dye wasn't used in photographic papers until really the late 1950s. The trouble is the artist here, Lewis Hine, died in 1940. So he would not have had access to these papers. And this was I thought that was a laser point. Maybe this is, oops, black. No, oops. Is there a laser point there? Well, it doesn't matter. Can I get my presentation back, please? Or not. I mean, you know. It's back, okay. And so, since I don't know how to work this thing, I can actually point. This is the very first attempt at a UV Viz standard. That's actually a little cap full of laundry detergent, which is loaded with optical brighteners. And what I was trying to do is say, well, you know, these prints have optical brighteners. Hey, and look at that thing down there. That's loaded with optical brighteners, too. But, you know, with the FBI investigating, the Southern District of New York investigating, and a lot of people in the field saying that I was wrong, I felt like I needed to increase the evidentiary value of these fairly terrible renderings of the UV Viz fluorescence. So it became a quest for my lab over many years. And so ultimately we came up with this. We have a sort of a gray card here. This is a normal light. That's why the big normal is up there. And then the standard itself, the target itself, I shouldn't really call it a standard, the target below. And in normal light, it just looks pretty blah. But if you turn the lights out and hit it with a black light or a near UV source, synonymous, that's what it looks like. So we have these phosphors now are fluorescing, and they're fluorescing at, there's some grays there, some neutral values there. There are only 3 phosphors in the mix, red, green, and blue phosphors. So the grays are made of the three phosphors, the red, green, blue. And then we have different intensities, and if you flip it over, they're a higher intensity level. So we go low, medium, high, and then we have this thing called ultra for really high levels of fluorescence. And so what's happening? What's the mechanism of fluorescence? Just real quick. So we have incident radiation. That's our UV source, our near UV source. And then that incident radiation moves electrons into a higher shell, and this excitation shell, and then they immediately fall back down to the ground state, and that releases photons, light. And the 2 major factors that we care about for UV Viz fluorescence are both the color of that emitted light, but also the intensity of that emitted light. And here's really the outline of the talk, and this is the outline of the development of the standard. And we'll get into, there's more kind of, I'm giving a workshop tomorrow. We'll get into more of the practical use of the standard. But these are the sort of major benchmarks for the development of the standard. The first benchmark was, well, find UV visible pigments. There's a ton of UV fluorescent paints out there. And we tried most of them, all of them, and they fade incredibly quickly. So it's just nothing that we could use to make a standard. What we ultimately had to do was find phosphors, just like phosphors in a cathode ray tube, TV set, or a computer monitor, and make our own paints. And so this Golden is a company in upstate New York, and they work with a lot of artists, but they've never worked with people like us before. I mean, we really put them through their paces to make these paints. And we made them over and over and over again, and they were incredibly patient with us. And they are pretty stable. So The row 3 and 4 are the UV fluorescent colors that we came up with, some gray patches, and then the red, green, blue. Row 2 is some optically brightened photographic paper. Row 1 is a bunch of different commonly occurring artist materials. And we just pulverize that with UV. And I think you can maybe see in row 2 some of the response of the optically brightened photographic paper really starts to darken up a lot. And just, we did some calculations. We kind of stopped the test once we started getting a max of the RGB values, going off by 2 points or two levels here. So we decided, okay, if it's drifting by 2 on any of the channels, of the RGB channels, then okay, it's out of spec. And just calculating that based on, well, if you use the standard like twice a week, let's say, it's probably going to last about 21 years. And if, and a lot of people don't use it twice a week. More like once every 2 months is actually fairly common. And we're thinking it's going to last about, 340 years, which is great unless you want to sell a lot of standards, which, we're not going to do here. We're not going to be replacing these. There's not a need to replace these. I would say safely 10 years would be a predicted lifespan for the standard, for the target, I should say. Identify and control variables. I mean, we've, the talks that we've seen already have really gone into the variables. I could even skip this, but I'm going to go through it really fast. So what are the variables? Well, the incident radiation. There are pretty much 3 common UV sources that are out there. This is low pressure mercury lamp. And what's important with a lamp is not just the emission, which here is right in the heart of the near UV at the 368 nanometer range, but also the filter, because we're looking at things in the dark, and we want the object itself to be the emission source. We don't want a lot of, stray visible light coming into the system from our source. So you'll see with this filter, there are some, very major visible peaks there, but it's not getting through the filter in this particular case. So there's low pressure mercury lamps, high pressure mercury lamps. You see a lot of these in conservation studios. And then LEDs. And LEDs, probably 2 or 3 years ago, probably were not a really good choice for UV-induced visible fluorescence, because the peak output, like for these flashlights that you'll see with airport security and all of that, it's practically in the visible range, and it's cranking out a ton of blue light. And we don't want that visible light interfering with the fluorescence of our objects. LEDs have come a long way in the past couple of years. The critical thing is both filtration and, can we push it a little further down, to like the 360s, 370 range. So, definitely a viable option, but, can be problematic as well. And, another major variable, cameras. We wanted this standard to work across multiple radiation sources and also multiple, capture sources. And this is a pretty, sophisticated analog to digital conversion here going on. And, I don't need to explain this to you in this room, but there's a lot going on in terms of processing. We have, analog signal processing and digital signal processing, and a lot of this is, kind of beyond our control. It's proprietary to the manufacturers. And so hopefully you get an image that looks something like the subject out the other end. The other major variable is filtration. So we need the on-camera, filtration, and most on-camera filtration is this BG38 filter or something like it. And you can see, okay, fine, but it's allowing a lot of IR to hit the sensor, but also a lot of UV to hit the sensor. So we're trying to, not have that, especially in these low light photography conditions. And so we need to cut the UV. We find the Ratten 2 works great, cuts UV in a little bit of blue. And then the PECA, it takes out that tail of IR, which can have a really dramatic effect on the quality of UV vis images, especially, again, given the long exposure times. And this gets us, pretty close to kind of a human vision sensitivity profile, in, for color vision anyway. Talk about intensity. So we have, we were talking about color, but also intensity is a huge problem. Well, not a problem, it's a huge challenge to kind of deal with. So we have, this is just a leather daguerreotype case, very low fluorescence, low level of fluorescence, which is common with a lot of organic materials. When you start getting inorganic materials like fluorescent minerals, you have high levels of fluorescence. And for sort of man-made dyes and things like that, these optical brighteners that were in those Lewis Hine prints, there's just ridiculous amount of fluorescence coming off of these. And so the simple solution was, and what we thought of first was, okay, we'll have 3 levels, sort of organic, inorganic, and then crazy, ultra. We did some user testing, and we actually ended up with 4 different levels. And people out there are now asking for 5 different levels of intensity. So as you can see, as you can imagine, intensity is a major issue with UV fluorescence, and capturing that and recording that intensity consistently is a real challenge. Probably the biggest challenge of the whole enterprise was defining a neutral gray. This was not easy because, again, you're evaluating color in the dark, which humans are not exactly necessarily equipped to do. And so neutral gray here is in quotes. And again, we only had 3 phosphors to work with, a red, a green, and a blue. So the criteria for our neutral gray was we wanted most cameras to interpret the gray as a neutral, so we could white balance, right, of course. But it's also important that the gray looks gray to a human. We were trying to create a standard that would render images that people thought were plausible, that made sense, that related to sort of the reality of inspecting an object with UV. And they would perform consistently well. The grays would perform consistently well with all of these different radiation sources that are available, the LED, high pressure mercury, all of that. This is what we came up with. And you can see it's really pushed, it's heavy towards the blue. And that's that's not a bug, that's a feature in this instance, because a lot of our users were saying, wait a minute, your UV vis documentation is way too blue. So if we pump blue into our gray, essentially, and we white balance on that gray, we can pull some of that blue out. And this was it took forever. One blue, one green, one red, should equal gray, right? No, it doesn't, it's not even close. So this was, some of my comments yesterday about the difficulties of coming up with standards. I mean, just this practical experience of coming up with a gray that you all would accept as gray was so highly subjective and so highly driven by different standard expert observers. The standard deviation around these expert observers would be, just off the charts. Again, we're evaluating this gray in the dark with our color vision effectively not turned off entirely, but certainly not really working at its optimal peak. So, this was a real challenge, probably the biggest challenge of the project, like I said. But this is our gray, believe it or not. Then we felt like we were ready to do some testing in the field. What we did was just on a black piece of foam core, we put different objects, commonly found objects, a credit card in there, some postage stamps, some photographs, some artist materials, at these 3 levels of fluorescence that we thought initially were the key, low, medium, and high. And we distributed these sets to different institutions, including the Rijksmuseum here, and I thank them very much for their cooperation in this project. And this is what we got, and we asked people to, well, just shoot it the way you would shoot it normally. And this is kind of the range of variations that we ended up with. And then we said, okay, well, wait, use the standard white balance, use our workflow, and see what you get. And this was our first trial, and we had much greater consistency. And so here's another way to put it. Here's the delta E. I'm looking for that degree from Roy Burns University, thank you. And so, here's some variation of these images. Delta E compared to an absolute deviation of different RGB levels for different pixels. So that's before, and this is after. So we definitely have much more repeatability, much more interoperability across many different cameras, many different radiation sources, many different filtration setups. So we felt pretty good about this. However, there were a lot of comments, a lot of criticisms, which we were expecting and invited, actually. And so here's the settings that we said, we thought were appropriate. And what people really wanted was more like this. So much more intensity. Even for things that are very dimly fluorescing, people wanted more intensity, and they wanted a lot less blue. And that's why we ended up, putting more blue into our gray, to pull out that blue when things were properly white balanced. And the other thing was, okay, we needed a 4th level of fluorescence for something much, much lower. With that step completed, we went into the production of the standards, and Don Williams at, Imaging Science Associates? I can't remember, sorry, Don. But anyway, he's the one who came up with the great design, sort of this laser cut template, and does all the assembly. He's the one who does all the fulfillment. We ended up with these 4 levels, like I said. There's sort of a daisy chain of grays here. So the lightest patch on the low becomes the darkest patch on the medium. The lightest patch on the medium becomes the darkest patch on high. And then, that pattern continues. So there's sort of this continuity across the 4 different fluorescing levels. And you just flip it over depending on what kind of fluorescence you want to document, high, low, et cetera. So yeah, Image Science Associates, there we go. And Don actually very kindly is offering a discount on these if you're interested. 2 and 3D UV will get you a discount if you order these. And so Don handles all the fulfillment, the purchasing. We've licensed all of that. We have a patent on this. We licensed it to him. But the company that I started, UV Innovations, we're basically doing workshops and training. And we've got multiple workshops going on every year in different locations. And yeah, here's our, we started marketing this in the fall of 2015. And here's the distribution map. We have about 143 targets in use. A lot, surprising, well, maybe not so surprisingly. A lot of these have gone to museums, for sure, but a lot of, sort of forensic outfits, police and other forensic imaging departments. I'm not sure what kind of time I've got. I probably am a little over. So here are some FAQs. From 2015, and I won't answer any of these, maybe if, because, hey, I'm out of time, No, I'm happy to actually answer all of these in discussion. Maybe I don't have so much time right now, but why so expensive? My God, it's the phosphors. They're so ridiculously expensive to make these paints. And then, this is a lament that I think all of us have probably heard, one time or another is, why don't images match what I see? I see, when I look at fluorescence, it's not there in the image. There are reasons for that, and we can talk about that. And then there's this other, which is related, but hey, I want to see more. There are features in the fluorescence that I'm not able to capture with your existing workflow, with the existing standards. This is a big one. Why don't some common medium format cameras white balance? And that's something that I really think deserves a lot more conversation, a lot more thought. Most DSLRs, no problem, but some of the more common medium format cameras have a real problem with the gray, probably because we have so much blue in that gray, right? And then, would you consider new designs, custom, absolutely. If you have a particular application, I really would like to hear about it. And just so to wrap up, back in 1999, I never had to testify about these fraudulent prints. But actually not that long ago, I was an expert witness in a murder case, actually to overturn a murder case, get somebody out of prison who'd been serving time for maybe 30 or so years. And the fluorescence of this police report became a key piece of evidence in the case. It had, there was, the police report had been tampered with, it had been shuffled, and you could only see the evidence of the reorganization of the report in the UV, with the UV fluorescence. And so, back in the day, I had no real great way to objectively indicate the fluorescence of those fraudulent prints. But, I was able to go into this case with full confidence that, if somebody had questioned what they were looking at, I could absolutely say that, this was an objective as possible, recording of the UV vis fluorescence. That's it. Thank you very much.
I've been recruited for Q&A to recap the sessions. This was a great track. Should we have the speakers go to the chairs? I'm going to take privilege to ask two questions. For Andrew, thank you. That was a great real-world overview. And I keep thinking at this juncture, maybe when we look at people going through photo school and imaging programs, I believe that what you showed would be the foundation of a college course, because the people coming up have no idea about this, and it's a good juncture that we've gotten to this point that maybe we all have to start really influencing the universities to start anyone teaching photography. This should be a prerequisite type thing to ISO standards. That may be one benefit. And for Paul, we have lots of discussions about how and why, what filters and all to arrive at what is neutral in UV. But are there any questions? This was a really fascinating discussion.
Question for Felix. I was wondering how you deal with the original raw files and the high-res 3D model before it's reduced to be shown on the web. How do you archive the individual components? How are those things labeled and organized so that they can be reconstituted later if need be? Which parts do you save? Which parts do you get rid of? So if you could just speak to that.
Difficult to answer. So we really, first at the beginning, We find it good to bring in the different raw files as a DNG file for the workflow, and there are very different steps we could improve, but at the moment it still works. So this is the most important thing, and there are so many small things we could improve, and also I'm not an image scientist, I have to tell, so we are also open for suggestion to make it better.
Does anyone in the audience have a sort of pipeline for what, for the question raised? Has anyone wrapped around this idea of what they're saving, or is it too early in the 3D? Oh yes, Carla, of course.
So yeah, we mostly look at photogrammetry rather than structured light, but we are.
Can you catch?
Well, that was fun. Yeah. Cool. So wow, it works and everything.
This is a new concept.
Yeah, I like it. So we work with photogrammetry rather than the structured light, but we're very focused on what we should be saving and what's sort of critical. So the original images, which we're shooting raw, recommending DNG to save, though our workflow also supports TIFF if that's your choice. And then metadata about how you shot it, and we have some tools that we're working on around that called the Digital Lab Notebook. And then key things that we think that you might want to export from your 3D project. So your 3D project is probably proprietary. You can export things like camera calibrations, masks, if you did masking, that kind of data that we recommend you save with the images. And you can choose whether to save your 3D model or not. I mean, depending on how long term you're planning to save it, but that would be enough information for somebody to rebuild what you've done. So our focus is kind of looking at what's the minimum set for somebody to understand what you did and rebuild what you, rebuild the model from your data. And potentially you might include additional things depending on your needs. But we're actively working in this area. If you go to our website, culturalheritageimaging.org, there's a digital lab notebook area, and we have tools that are in beta, and we would love feedback on them, and we're working on some recommendations around exactly this.
Okay. Just to contribute, yes.
Well, it's just a comment slash question for Andrew. First, a really very nice, extremely official. So using Coca, you're implicitly using Argyle behind the scenes, right?
Yes.
So the comment was that I've personally found, I use Argyle directly.
Yeah, I've found that I can get much better results in Argyle if I switch to an XYZ color lookup table, and if I set the quality settings to extremely high quality, like absurdly high quality. So I wonder whether you've looked at that and if it might then prevent you from having to do the manual color curve adjustment that you did in raw therapy.
Yes, yeah. I mean, so, you know, I guess it comes back to this discussion of, you know, who's a colour scientist? Certainly not me. I'm on the Argyle email list, but this is the extent of my interaction with it, if I'm honest. You know, this is way beyond my understanding at the moment. So, you know, if I'm honest, you know, I used Coca, which uses Argyle, because it's free, and for the purpose of my test, it was the best option.
Oh yeah, I think Coca is great, and we use Coca as well, but my suggestion then, if you haven't looked at it, is that there are drop-down boxes in Coca where you can choose how it builds the color profile, and one of the options is an XYZ color lookup table, or CLUT, and then there's also a drop-down setting for the quality. And basically, you can choose a higher quality profile, and it takes a couple more minutes to make, and it ends up being 500 kilobytes instead of 20 kilobytes. But this had a massive effect on the quality of our profiles.
Thank you.
I would suggest, as we look at open source, I tend to look at throwing our needs to manufacturers to wrap into the tools that are more accessible, because that came up yesterday, that it's too complicated. So some people are comfortable with open source. I would suggest the people that are using open source, if you have a recipe, that's the kind of thing we should share, because you get 200 people using Argyle and playing, you're going to make it worse than better, I think. So that's maybe, if we are going open source and putting it out on blogs and such, we should put the recipes and discuss that a little bit, because it could go crazy before it gets better.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's my comment at the discussion panel yesterday about most users of this stuff not being color scientists means that we have to have the defaults be the sanest, most reliable things that we can choose.
Yeah, and so, you know,
Too many knobs and
yeah.
gizmos.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Yeah, hi, sorry. It's a comment rather than questions for Andrew, really, and it's sort of echoing what you said, Scott, about, you know, we need to get to the educators and we need this sort of thing being taught at universities. You know, I think, you know, we've discussed this as part of AFAP and you know, I'd like to see some of the output from the work you're doing that we get to those educators and make sure that this stuff is taught at grassroots, because it's just not happening.
Yeah,
in my experience. Yeah.
It's a prerequisite course. If there are photo schools teaching, this is the underpinnings.
Yeah.
I mean, so just, you know, I came from teaching photography into museums. That's what I did before working in museums. And I've, you know, written part of photography textbooks. So I love photography education, very passionate about it. But I mean, just, you know, just to be kind of devil's advocate, you know, I think actually, yes, wonderful to teach this in universities to people starting with photography. It's a very useful tool. But, you know, we should understand it in the museums first. We all need to really understand it first. You know, are there actually enough people out there who could teach this in universities at the moment? I really don't think so.
Well, that was my concern, you know, the instructors need to be instructed. And I think we're at a point of clarity with 2D art reproduction that I think there's enough people using it, practitioners, that could train the trainers to train the students. But that may take 5 years, but it's important to get going, yeah.
We're also training the conservation and restoration students at the University of Amsterdam in the same basics of color theory and the open source workflows for how to do this, so that when they enter museums as professionals, they at least know to ask for these things from the photographers. Mm-hmm. And in many cases, these are people taking photos just day to day with their iPhone or something in the conservation lab. And you can build a nice reproducible workflow because an iPhone of today was the museum grade camera of 10 years ago.
Definitely, right? Yeah. It's an advanced tool, yeah.
Yeah, so that's another initiative that we're trying, is to make sure that the conservators, and also I'm teaching technical art history students the same thing, so that they know what to ask for and how to assess whether their photos are color managed and if they're any good.
Great. Okay, Cecile, how are we on time? We're okay? Any other questions? Oh, yeah.
Hi, it's a question for Felix, quite a practical one. Could you say a little bit more about how you host the 3D models on your website? You know, what 3D model hosting are you using to show those?
Yeah, we developed our own 3D viewer with WebGL, and for sure you have to show different levels of the texture, the color texture. We have a specularity layer, and we have the normal map. At the moment we cannot show point clouds, but we want to bring it up in the next time, so also the 3D viewer can show point clouds. And the models in JSON format, and we have 3 different kind of resolutions. So if you have different mobile devices and different connections over the internet, you get the right resolution. So we have 2K, 4K, and 8K textures at the moment. Is it okay?
Thank you.
Yes.
I wanted to, hi, Roy Burns here. I wanted to talk a moment about iPhones and, well, phones in general as far as documentation. So in our cameras that we're using, professional cameras, there's not spatial processing that's based on the image, right? You're making these profiles that are going to be working for every image that you take, assuming you don't change exposure and lighting and so forth. In cell phones, you are getting changes that are image dependent. So in other words, if I have an image, let's say I'm taking a portrait and you're holding up your color checker, I'm going to get a different result than if I just take a picture of the color checker. So there's lots of processing that's going on that's spatially dependent. And so I think we need to be careful about treating an iPhone image as a color record.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
It's highly calculated, yeah.
when I say iPhone, I just mean that generically, like mobile phone. I'm not in the Apple ecosystem, but I know that with Android, there are apps where you can really get the raw photo. So you can skip all of the built-in fancy dark black magic that happens to make your photos pop, and you can just get what the sensor saw and then bring that into a normal workflow so that it is a reliable, reproducible capture device.
It'd be fun to have a museum-driven app for imaging that someone could write that does what Rob's talking about, is like stripping it and using it as a professional camera, but I don't know if that's possible. I can't do it.
On Android, it is possible. I know that.
Yeah. Any other questions? Oh.
This is so cool. I just wanted to mention to Felix that there are open source 3D model viewers that are, a particular one that's built by the Italian National Research Council in Pisa called 3D Heritage Online Presenter, or 3D HOP, which will allow you to move 100 million polygons at points at, you know, regular interactive speeds. So if you had a more robust viewer, you wouldn't have to do the normal map messing around to try to get an acceptable level of high frequency detail. You could just use the higher polygon count model and skip all that.
The full model
Yeah.
with
Or-
texture.
Or something that's bigger than a million polygon.
That's valuable.
Right.
Yes, that's true, but maybe we don't want to give away the high-res models at the moment.
Well, that's your choice.
That's
Yeah.
a different problem.
Right.
Yeah, it's a different problem. No, but this is a problem of who should have the models and who not in the end. And also we know that there are different kinds of viewers now, and also we think about work with IIIF in the future to have a 3D viewer which shows the models on the basis of IIIF, and not every institution has its own viewer, but to have one in common. So, but at the moment we have not, and when we build up this portal, also we haven't had other viewers, so we thought about to use Flash, but we want to bring in some plugins, so we developed this some years ago. But now things change, and at the moment we think about how we can bring in point clouds, and also if you have a very big models, big size, and you want to transfer it on mobile devices with a low-level internet, then you have a problem with a lot of polygons and with a lot of points, I think.
It depends how the viewer is written. If it's tile in, speeds.
Yeah, it depends. But at the moment we don't have this viewer, so we took this solution. But in the future, maybe we do something like this.
Yeah, you can download it from
Yeah, thank you.
CNR.
We could take that to the break discussion and give us some feedback later. That would be a good thing, because this easily digs deep. Yes?
So this question's actually for Paul. I work at the Getty Museum. I've been using your targets for 2 years now. And I was wondering, are you making any plans to build a target that actually identifies certain types of materials? I think you touched on that. To help us for the conservators to know like what type this is resin or different types of materials so they can identify it with them labeled and such?
Yeah, I think that would be a fantastic application. I mean, the short answer is no. This process was exhausting enough. I never want to do this again. But yeah, no, I mean, they're kidding aside. I mean, I probably am not the one to necessarily do that, but I think that's a great application. And I think that's something that's going to, there's a real need for that. So many commonly encountered artist materials have a very characteristic fluorescence in the near UV, which is very accessible to us. And you can identify these pigments and resins with a fairly quick inspection that conservators are trained to do in graduate school. But to port that over to kind of common documentation within museums, we're not quite there yet. And the first step, I think, would be to create a target like the one that you're talking about.
Right, I mean, to have those standards across the board so that
Yeah.
museum to museum, we're talking about the same thing.
Yeah.
Because it's so easy to see something different because of the color space.
Right. I mean, yeah.
Another great conversation.